Es distinta a la que habitualmente hacemos porque es de una entrevista grabada. El título es Cómo impacta en América Latina lo ocurrido en Siria, el cambio de gobierno, la caída del régimen de Bashar Al-Assad, con particular apoyo y con particular acento en lo que tiene que ver con Venezuela. Hoy ese es nuestro tema aquí en Noche D, de tal cual, que agradecemos estés viendo, siguiendo por nuestras plataformas digitales, tanto en X, arroba diario tal cual, como en YouTube. En todos los casos quedarán las grabaciones allí. Hoy tenemos otras dos particularidades. La primera es que nuestro invitado es internacional. Él es Ruslan Trad, nuestro invitado es periodista, pero fundamentalmente es investigador en temas de seguridad, de riesgo también y de conflictos en Europa, Europa del Este particularmente, y en la zona del Medio Oriente y de África. Ha sido periodista para distintas publicaciones europeas sobre estos temas. Ha sido también corresponsal de guerra en el Líbano, en Turquía, en Irak, en Túnez y en Arabia Saudita. Y en 2014 fue premiado como activista del año por el Comité Helsinki por su trabajo y su activismo en el en campos de refugiados y en la cobertura sobre la guerra civil en Siria. Así que es un conocedor de estos temas que ha publicado varios libros sobre las realidades y los conflictos de los países árabes y hoy nos atiende esta entrevista también como investigador del Atlantic Council para Estados Unidos. La otra particularidad de esta entrega de Noche D del día de hoy es que Ruslan Trad no habla español, por lo que esta entrevista que van a ver a continuación fue grabada originalmente en inglés. En este caso la estamos presentando traducida al español con subtítulos para que puedan seguir el audio original con la versión subtitulada y puedan entender el contenido. En cualquier caso, agradecemos que nos acompañen en este Noche D con Ruslan Trad. Les dejamos la entrevista. So, Ruslan, first of all, thank you for joining us in this conversation. And we're going to start with asking you about what's the main concern that do you think we as Latin American people should have about what is going on in Syria, the impact on this region, if any?
Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation and opportunity to speak to people I'm usually not reaching out because of the language differences and time
Yeah.
zones and everything other. But in actually our regions, I'm based in Europe, but following Middle East very closely. The regions are interconnected in many ways. And that is one of the reasons why, for so many years, the Syrian government, Syrian regime based in Damascus, especially after Baath party came to power in the late 60s, uh, provided not only platform but also developed very close ties and relations with governments friendly on that time governments in the Latin America, and one of the reasons why it was not only the Soviet Union and the fight against imperialism and American influence in that region, but also economic ties, for example, with Cuba and later, much later with Venezuela, especially after 2000s, the beginning of the 2000s, uh,
Yeah.
because of the economic links. And all of these links are the first thing comes to my thinking right now as an example of what will happen from now onward. Because um, for example, the friendship and cooperation between Tehran and Caracas is very important for Tehran. And there is no by coincidence that Iranian ships arrived in that part of the world very far from Middle East because of exchange of even oil and money. So this transferring of goods from one region to another uh, across Africa to Latin America and back to Middle East and opposite is very important for regimes like this in Iran and in Syria to circumstance the sanctions. And this is a cooperation very fruitful for the both sides.
In the case of Venezuela, we had like flight routes between Caracas and Damascus, and we have that relationship with Iran, as you are explaining. Do you think the relationship with Iran, between Iran and Venezuela, between Tehran and Caracas, can maintain its normality, if we can say like that, without Damascus on the map,
I think
diplomatic map?
so. Yeah, I think so. I think so because, as you mentioned, the relation between Venezuela and Iran is strong and not from yesterday. And in many cases, Iran used Lebanese and Syrian diaspora in Latin America to develop these links. We know that there are even politicians coming from these societies and communities in different countries across Latin America. And these diasporas are very important for diplomatic relationships. So in many cases, the lack of support coming from the Syrian regime right now, I think will not hurt the already existed networks Iran developed across the region. But in the same time, it could be a problem because of many mediators between Iran and other governments in the Latin America. People with Syrian passports or Lebanese passports, they acted as mediators, but they also have money coming from Damascus because the government in Damascus provided the platform for such travelings, diplomatic cover, and all other activities. So it could be a problem, but in my opinion, the networks will survive for now.
You have been covering the Syrian reality for many years, and studying all the intricate situation in that country. Um, have you ever came across information about uh, the relationship with Venezuela being more than just diplomatic ties, about exchanging of passport documents, safe haven for people, or something like that, that you think is worth mentioning right now?
Um, this is interesting question, very important one, because it's very easy to jump from the journalistic conversation and to intelligence information, because according to investigations, Venezuela is playing very important role for the regimes in Damascus and Tehran. And in many cases, diplomatic cover is just one of the meanings how these relationships are being developed. But underground, there are a lot more stuff, including this exchange of resources, assets, and also um, providing support for not so diplomatic efforts. Well, there are people with passports, both Venezuelan and Syrian, for example, or Lebanese, Venezuelan, that are playing role in these networks. So to me, it's important all these people to be watched or monitored, because we don't know right now what will be their usage after the fall of the Assad regime, and how this money are being used right now, because there is a huge flow of money between the countries. So what will happen with all these resources? Where are we going, and who is behind these networks right now? Because one player is out of the game, and who will replace this player? we should be not naive to think that things just disappeared or there is a new page in the relationships. Of course, there is a lot of stuff underground.
And yes, given that the Assad regime crumbled, fell down, whatever it's going to become the new government of power in place there in Syria, uh, mm, usually it's evaluated from the religious point of view and not in the mm, more like a Western view of left versus right, right? So, do you think it's possible for countries like Venezuela, regimes like Venezuela, to understand and to have to maintain ties with whatever kind of actors are going to take power and consolidate maybe a government in Syria?
Well, given the signals already sent by Caracas to Damascus, we know that Venezuelan government already expressed solidarity with the Assad regime, but that was news from the yesterday.
Hmm.
Um, I believe that Venezuela thinks Middle East is important for the relationships and economy and diplomatic efforts. So I don't think Venezuela will just cut relationships with local governments. I think they will wait for a while to see what will happen on the ground because in Syria it's not stable right now. Maybe for the next months will be a military zone. We are witnessing right now at least two military operations from the Turkish army, from Israeli army, and there is also instability inside the Syrian territory in the western and central part of Syria. So they will need time for calculating the risk or establishing links because the former government of Assad was very clear, very close to Venezuelan government. But on the same time, we are speaking about interests. So I think that Venezuelan government will maintain presence, or at least some diplomatic presence in Damascus, but definitely will be careful, not because of religious or similar side, but because of political meaning of this act.
Yes, in fact, we saw that piece of news about Maduro was the last president to express solidarity, last call, like 4 days before Assad fled the country. And also, there's already a statement by the Venezuelan government about what happened this weekend in Syria. Very, very plain wording uh, that writing that statement about Venezuelan government, uh, signaling hopes for the best for that country. Uh, we'll come down to Venezuela and Latin America, but I want to ask you about Russia, the Russia involvement in this, and Turkey also. Because from our point of view in Venezuela, the Russian government is very important, is an ally of Nicolas Maduro. And also, Erdogan government in Turkey is also an ally of Nicolas Maduro. And the government of Venezuela have said Putin is like our big brother, Erdogan is like a brother. Those are two presidents that have recognized Maduro as the winner of the presidential election of July 28th. And I think Russia has also said like that they are expecting to Maduro to have another term in office, and everything's going to be normal about it. So let's talk about Russia for a minute and its influence on Syria, because you see all these people and all these publications saying, well, Assad came down because it did not have full support or necessary support from Moscow to keep in power and to fight back in front of what was happening in that country. So do you believe this? What was the role of Russia in this last days or month, maybe?
Uh, well, I'm more skeptical on that statements. Not because Russia wasn't important for the Assad regime in providing stability, security, and etc. Um, because the Russian Federation considered Syria very important for the military adventures far from Syrian borders. For example, Syria became a springboard for military operations of the Russian army in Libya and sub-Saharan Africa and beyond. So the Russians are very calculating right now on how they are playing the game in Syria, because they need to maintain the existence based on the Mediterranean Sea. Even while other bases inland Syria are not operating right now. So they had 4 to 6 bases. It depends on how they are operating currently, but the most important is the base in Khmeimim. Is very important for the Russian army, how they are express the influence in the region. And in many cases, the Syrian army was disintegrated from the first years of the civil war. What I mean is that the Syrian government forces, they existed only on paper. In reality, the whole, if you remember the map of the Syrian conflict before the recent events, you can see the government held territory. But actually, this territory was held by different militias loyal to the regime in Damascus, but receiving funds from local oligarchs. So their loyalty was in question, which could be one of the reasons why they were not motivated to fight. We saw fighting in some places like Hama or in Damascus, in Aleppo in the first 2 days, but nothing more. Yes, of course, the Air Force of the Russian Federation based in Syria is important actor for providing security for the Assad regime, but you cannot turn the table just with jets. You need forces on the ground, which Iran provided, but they also disappeared. And that is the question: what Iran will do next? And all of these considerations are made with Russia in question, because Russia and Iran and Turkey, they have totally different visions for the Syrian future. But I'm skeptical on that the Russian army or not providing cover for the Syrian army was the main issue or factor behind the collapse of the Syrian regime. Actually, the main fault lies with the Syrian regime itself and the corruption inside and the lack of motivation for the soldiers to fight, after all, their fellow citizens.
And what was the role of Turkey in what happened? Because we have seen information about Turkey has been financing some military groups also taking
Yeah.
part in the civil war against
Yes.
the regime that is supported by Putin, and Turkey and Russia are kind of a close government. So, what do we need to say about this to understand?
Yeah. The main thing here is to understand that Turkey and Russian federations are frenemies. Uh, to say that with jargon words, what I mean is that Ankara and Moscow, they have different political visions at first for Syria, but not only for Syria. They are geopolitical enemies in many cases, in Central Asia, for example, in Africa also. And they have common disgrace of the Western governments, but that's all. Everything other is in opposite side. So they had very different visions how to do and how to maintain influence in Syria or different regions. The role of Turkey recently is under question because what I understand from my conversations with diplomatic staff and other people as sources, it was that the rebel offensive was surprising event for many of them, including Ankara. Ankara, they knew that there is something to come, but nothing like this. But right now, after the fall of the regime in Damascus, the Turkish army providing currently support for Turkish-based rebels united under the alliance Syrian National Army, which alliance wasn't active in the recent events, but they stayed in standby mode in the northern part of the country, and the main operation they're conducting are against the Kurdish forces. So this is very pretty clear that Ankara is behind these military operations right now, because as we are speaking, there are military operations in northern Syria against the Kurdish forces. And that is one of the conflicts already reactivated and already exploiting by a regional force like Turkey.
Okay, and about the role of the U.S. in all this, we have seen also people saying, and close people from the Maduro government propaganda sphere, saying, well, all this comes down to the interest of Israel and particularly the U.S. to topple down a government that it's against the positions of capitalism and the control of U.S. imperialism and all this. Uh, what was the role, if any, of the U.S. in this conflict, and specifically in these last days that resulted in Assad losing power?
Yeah. Just a remark for anyone who considers the Syrian regime anti-capitalist or um, not so mercantile. It was the opposite, pretty much capitalist regime with a lot of money spent for luxuries. You can see the footage, for example, of cars in Damascus. But that's another question. Ideology here plays nothing as role, unfortunately, because at least they should have ideology, but they betrayed all of these so-called socialist goals of the Ba'ath Party and everything. United States have very interesting role in Syria. Interesting on expert meaning. It's limited, definitely, not like Iranian or the Russian one. They are presented with forces, very limited forces in the eastern part of Syria, mainly supporting the Kurdish forces, the Syrian Democratic Forces based in the eastern part of Syria. And the main concern for United States there is defeating Islamic State and also providing support for the Kurdish forces, which means also taking advantage of the fact that eastern part of Syria is resourceful. So there are a lot of resources there. And maybe this is part of the price for their presence, but nothing more. The United States were inactive player on the ground. The only one case before the recent war between Israel and Iranian-backed groups like Hezbollah and Hamas. Before that, the only one case United States attacked or were active, different than attacking Islamic State positions, is back to 2018 when they returned fire to Wagner and other Russian forces, attacked Kurdish forces, and that was the only case before recent events. But for Israel, it is really interesting realpolitik for Tel Aviv, how they are developing relationships across the region. Because in fact, even by words of the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, the Assad regime played double role. On one hand, the regime in Syria was part of the axis of resistance. On the other hand, since the last war between Israel and Syria in the 70s, this, according to words coming from Israel, was the most stable border of Israel, the Syrian border. That is because of negotiations between Assad regime and Israel. And we can see that after the war between Israel and Hezbollah, and after the killing of the Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah, if I'm not wrong, the Assad regime reacted with only statement, even not television speech or something like that, statement in the Sun, the state news agency, 5 days after the killing of Hassan Nasrallah. And for Israel, Assad was not a friend, but known enemy. And for now, they are conducting airstrikes in Syria because they want to destroy every possible military asset close to the Israeli border, creating this so-called buffer zone, because they don't know who is in Damascus right now.
Yeah. Ruslan, I want to ask you about Russia again, because one of the things that have been said also is like, well, Russia is very much in Ukraine, occupied with Ukraine, or busy with Ukraine. So they don't have like too much tools to be part of other conflicts and meddling with the realities of other places. And that goes back again to Venezuela, because we have listened to the opposition now in these past hours, saying, well, what happened in Syria is like a song to hear in Caracas, not because of the violence and the civil war and all that, but because, well, if Assad, who had military interest of Russia, very strong military interest in Russia there, did not had the support of Russia, maybe Maduro is not going to have the support of Russia in a scenario where he really needs it. And I'm not talking about military aid or anything. I'm talking about geopolitical strategy, geopolitical aid. So do you think Russia is actually with more that it can handle on its plate, or not?
I think in the case of Venezuela, it is opposite. Putin needs Maduro, not the opposite. Venezuela is much more independent from the Russian support than Assad regime. Yes, there is a list of problems in Venezuela, and the government in Caracas is facing very huge difficulties. I believe in the future they will face more like that. But the situation is different. The government in Caracas is much stable than the Syrian one. And Venezuela is not facing civil war. I should remind that Syria was in civil war for 13 years.
Yes.
So a lot of people died, more than 500,000. And the economy was in disaster mode, which is not the case with Venezuela, even with all the problems facing right now by the people there. And in that case, because of the resources of Venezuela and the strategic location of the country, I I think the Russian Federation is more dependent from Venezuela than the opposite. So any local events should be considered local because the Russians don't have assets there. They have few people stationed on the ground, more or less linked to the Ministry of Defense and Russian military intelligence, but not like in Syria.
You have been studying all these geopolitical realities and relationships between countries and all that. So I want to ask you to explain to our audience, how can we understand when we say geopolitical aid, and that's a term I'm using, not you, but if you can try to land that concept to be easily understand by people hearing this, because I'm not talking about a military thing, but I'm talking about diplomatic, geopolitical impact and influence, and about the spheres of influence. Latin America being the ground for American influence, and now Trump saying I want to put Marco Rubio as Secretary of State, and he's from with the Cuban family and all that, and then Russian is like, yeah, but I have interest there also. I have relationships with Venezuela, with Cuba, I have relationship with Nicaragua, for example, and with Brazil because of BRICS. So I'm asking you to paint a picture about what we must understand about geopolitical interests, spheres of influence, and how can we land that on reality? Because not everything is about, I'm going to send you some planes to enact in a war or something. We are talking about a lot of other stuff.
Yes, absolutely. We need to speak for another player in that topic, and that this player is China. This is something we are missing from the analysis of the recent events because Beijing is not active actor, but on the global scale, and especially in Latin America, China is different. On all of these processes, we need to understand that everything is interconnected right now. It's not like in the past. We are not living in 19th century. We are living in a world well connected, and all the political processes and economics one are interconnected because we are depending of each other. And on that scale, in my opinion, we should comment a lot more on what is the role of China in that region, and how diplomatic efforts are interconnected to its other meanings. To me, the Chinese factor is much more important on the global scale.
And we are reaching the end of the interview. I don't want to take you much more time from you, but about Ukraine and about Russia and about what is happening in that specific war, how do you think this is going to impact Ukraine, or what happened in Ukraine, given that Zelensky is already saying things about his openness to have some conversations, and Donald Trump saying I can fix that, and all that. Do you think that what happened in Syria is going to impact the war in Ukraine?
The civil war in Syria and the war in Ukraine are connected events, because right after the annexation of Crimea, the Russian army exploited the situation in Syria and intervened in the Syrian civil war on behalf of the Syrian government. And the most important thing and connection between the two wars is the testing of military models and weapons by the Russian army. So the model tested by the Russian army in Syria 1 year before annexation of Crimea in 2014. It was tested first in Syria, and after the annexation of the Crimea and the intervention of the Russian army in Syria in 2015, the Russian Federation rotates forces from Syria to Ukraine and vice versa. And there is one moment from the recent Syrian events where not receiving a lot of attention, and that is the role of the Ukrainian military intelligence. All of the signals are saying that the military intelligence of Ukraine provided at least parts for drones developed by Ukrainians to the Syrian rebels in the northwestern Syria. And this is important moment because Ukraine, especially the military intelligence, have a goal to disturb every possible every possible way for the Russian Federation to support its economy and to disturb every of the possible ways to gather resources, for example, from Africa or Middle East, because these resources are going directly in the military efforts of the Russian Federation. So the recent news from Syria are very bad for the Russian Federation, and this is good for Ukraine. And I think the important thing here is how Ukrainian army will resist the new developments on the front line in Ukraine, because this is another topic, but also bad news for Ukraine. And the most important right now is what will happen with the military assets of the Russian Federation in Syria, because they have ships and they have jets.
And last but not least, we've been seeing this civil war happening for more than a decade, but the events that ended up with Assad fleeing Syria were like 10 days or something like that, very quickly, what we saw in the last week and a half. What do you think we should learn about timing, politics, and stability of a political system or political government or even a dictatorship like the one of Assad in Syria, uh, with these events in that we saw in these last days?
It's definitely that a government cannot survive with institutions not working and not providing justice for the people, because sooner or later that will be asked by the citizens of your country. They will need answers. And for 5 decades, the Syrian regime failed to establish a working state, a state without corruption, or at least minimum level of corruption. This is a lesson should be learned by many governments across the world. These 10 days were possible because the Syrian regime itself was disintegrated long ago. They existed only on paper. And that is because the main reason is that the people lost faith in their government long ago.
In fact, I read information about military personnel defending the government, that when they face the other side, they say, do whatever you want. I'm not going to I'm not going to shoot. I'm not going to do anything. I'm not going to defend this anymore. Did you see
Yes,
information? Yes. And that
yes,
sounds
there
like
are
that's telling. That's telling.
cases of soldiers changing uniforms under the trees. and soldiers don't want to shoot rebels because they don't have faith on why they are fighting. They don't have good salaries. They don't have social insurance. This is something not exist in Syria for a long time. They don't have any reason to give their lives for an oligarchic regime. They don't see a reason to do that.
Yeah, as a political, a military analyst in Venezuela used to say, military personnel is loyal until it isn't, and that happens
Absolutely, absolutely,
everywhere. Everywhere.
absolutely.
Ruslan, thank you very much for having this conversation with me and explaining things to us, and thank you for giving us the time to participate in this interview. It's been very interesting.
Thank you.